On October 25th, 1957, Albert Anastasia, the underworld boss of the Gambino crime family and one of the founders of the notorious Murder, Inc., stepped into the barber shop at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. As he reclined in the barber chair, two men with scarves covering their faces kicked in the door, pushed the barber aside, and began shooting. Anastasia's murder was part of a power struggle between crime families, and it did garner national attention. But more importantly, it would lead to a historic meeting of the leaders of the underworld syndicates that would change both the public's and law enforcement's attitude towards organized crime in the United States. The November 1957 Apalachin meeting is history that deserves to be remembered.
The men who ordered the hit on Anastasia were Vito Genovese, the new leader of the Luciano crime family that would eventually become known as the Genovese crime family, and Carlo Gambino, Anastasia's own underboss. Genovese had become acting boss for the Luciano crime family when Lucky Luciano was sent to prison in 1936. In 1937, Genovese then fled the country to hide in Sicily, fearing prosecution for a murder, and Frank Costello became the acting boss for the Luciano family. Genovese, however, still nursed an ambition to control the family. He returned to the United States in 1945 and was immediately arraigned on the murder charges, but the case was dropped after the death of the prosecution's star witness. It wasn't until the 1950s that he was able to move on Costello and Costello's ally, Albert Anastasia, who headed his own family. On May 2nd, 1957, Vincent the Chin Gigante shot Frank Costello, grazing his forehead, on orders from Genovese and Gambino. Though he survived the shooting, Costello was convinced to retire and hand over control to Genovese. Anastasia, however, was incensed and sought permission from the commission to go after Genovese. Instead, Joseph Joe Bananas Bonanno, another godfather, arranged a meeting where Genovese and Anastasia supposedly settled their feud. Based on rumors that Costello was planning a comeback, Genovese ordered the hit on Anastasia. Anastasia's murder was the first murder of a mafia boss in public since the 1931 founding of the Commission. Genovese had successfully killed his greatest threat, but capo regimes loyal to Anastasia were ready to go to war with him, to get revenge. Genovese hoped to consolidate and legitimize his new position, and so he called a meeting of the Commission of the Leadership of the Cosa Nostra. Formed by Lucky Luciano in the aftermath of the bloody New York power struggle called the Castellamarese War to mediate conflicts between families and oversee criminal activities across the country, the commission consisted of the heads of the 5 families of New York, along with the Chicago outfit and other mafia families across the country in cities like Tampa, Detroit, Buffalo, and elsewhere. Anastasia had been muscling in on other families' business, and the commission itself had sanctioned the assassination, but his death still left much to discuss. In addition to discussing Anastasia's death and its fallout, there were other important topics at hand as well, such as the growing interest in Cuba, a new federal drug law, and a deal with Sicilian gangsters to bring enormous quantities of heroin into the United States. The commission met every 5 years. In 1956, they had met at gangster Joseph Joe the Barber Barbara's home in the small town of Apalachin, New York, without attracting undue attention. When Genovese called the meeting, the initial plan appears to have been to hold the meeting in Chicago, where the Chicago outfit could protect the attendance, but some investigations into Chicago gangsters prompted Stefano the Undertaker Magaddino, the Buffalo boss, to suggest instead that the meeting be held at Apalachin again. However, the previous meeting was not entirely without mishap. Carmen Galante, an underboss for the Bonanno family, was pulled over for speeding nearby. He was arrested, and investigators learned of his visit to Apalachin. A team of officers attempted to bribe the police to release Galante, but ultimately the underboss was held for 30 days. More importantly, it brought Barbara under scrutiny. The call for a meeting went out to crime families across the country. Not all families responded, but a large number of them did. Santo Trafficante, boss of a crime family in Tampa. Frank DeSimone, an attorney who led the crime family in Los Angeles. Sam Giancana, boss of the Chicago outfit, and gangsters from Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Illinois, Dallas, Colorado, and Kansas City decided to attend the meeting, including numerous top leaders like Joe Profaci, Carlo Gambino, Joe Bonanno, Tommy Lucchesi, and, of course, Vito Genovese. Several of the leaders were new to their positions, a fact that made a nationwide meeting popular. But the guest list ballooned so quickly that Joe Barbara had to demand that the attendees leave their wives, girlfriends, and dates at home. He could only house so many people. Of the many people gathered that day, possibly the largest gathering of powerful mafiosos in a single location in American history, almost all were Italian, with the exception of a caretaker for the estate, and all were men except for Josephine Barbara and a housekeeper. Edgar Croswell was a veteran state police officer who was dedicated to his job and knowledgeable about the mob connections of nearby boss Joe Barbara. On November 13th, he and a partner were in a hotel in Vestal, New York, when he saw a large Cadillac pull up outside and a man step out. He pulled his partner into the office of the hotel, and they overheard the man reserving 3 rooms, but refusing to give their names. Croswell was familiar with the man. It was Joe Barbara Jr., Joe the barber's son. That wasn't the only clue. Barbara had promised to break out a new grill for the meeting and placed an order for 200 pounds of meat. All signs pointed to a large party. Croswell and his partner decided to check out Barbara's house, where they found a number of high-end cars. Also noticed that the cars had license plates from states all over the country. Croswell suspected that the meeting had something to do with illegal alcohol sales. Barbara owned a Canada Dry plant that was suspected of being a front for his illegal activities. The state officer called in 2 more personnel to examine the meeting from the Alcohol Tax Unit, part of the Treasury Department from nearby Binghamton. Croswell staked out the hotel through the night, but noticed little activity. On the 14th, he, his partner, and the alcohol tax agents had a late breakfast before driving up to Barbara's house on McFall Road a little after noon. At least a dozen cars were at the house now, which only intrigued the police further. Croswell started calling in for backup and to set up a roadblock. The day was rainy, but stopped around noon. Most of the invited mobsters had arrived, but they hadn't yet noticed the gathering of officers in plain clothes. What set them off was a fish delivery man when he left the compound only to turn around. Croswell had been preparing his sting. He allowed the first car that left the estate to go without stopping. In the car were 2 relatively low local mobsters, and they were stopped 3 miles away from Apalachin. Apparently having a good run of luck, mob boss Tommy Lucchesi was running late, detected the police presence before he arrived in Apalachin, turned around and retreated back to New York City. The first car had been a test to see if the police in the roadblock were interested in topping everyone. Of course, the gathered mafiosos weren't going to sit around and wait and were looking for a way out. When the first car passed without a problem, the rest of the cars were suddenly getting on the road. When they started driving, Croswell and the 2 revenue officers were the only officers on the scene. Others had begun setting up other roadblocks. Croswell stopped the first car, a Chrysler Imperial, which held none other than Vito Genovese himself, among others. Genovese claimed that they had only been at the estate to wish the ailing Barbara a quick recovery. Cars lined up behind the Imperial with dozens of mobsters inside. Croswell had no choice but to let the car go. After checking the trunk, he waved Genovese through. Simply didn't have the manpower to arrest the mobsters as they left the compound. Had to count on the other roadblocks that officers were setting up further down the road. Besides, that wasn't his only problem. Some of the men had been watching to see what would happen when the cars left, and as soon as the Imperial was stopped, they decided that they were better off escaping on foot. They fled like ballet bells in pursuit of the fawn, the Newark Star-Ledger reported. While no actual crime had yet been committed by the men gathering, nearly everyone had a criminal record, and multiple men were under orders not to leave their home states. The only gunshot of the day rang out when Croswell asked an arriving trooper to fire his revolver as a warning. Fleeing on foot wasn't an easy proposition for men in high-priced suits in the middle of nowhere. No trails led off the property, and they were forced to bushwhack through dense undergrowth, wet with rain. It took about 8 hours, well into the night, but all, or nearly all the men who tried to get away on foot were apprehended. What they captured was, a British journalist put it, a chamber of commerce of crime. Meanwhile, some of Barbara's visitors had made the difficult choice to simply wait it out. From within the Barbara's posh living room, they simply waited to hear that they were under arrest or that the police had packed up and gone home. They had very little information until around 2:30, when Joe Barbara Jr. returned to the house past the roadblocks. He was immediately sent back out and arrested as soon as he hit the first roadblock. The exact number detained has remained confusing. The New York Times reported 65, while other newspapers reported 58 or 62. Wikipedia puts the number at more than 60. Croswell put the number at an even 60. None of them were immediately arrested, but they were detained. In New York, that gave police 12 hours to investigate before the man had to be let go. The mafia hadn't remained hidden being stupid, so none of the mafiosos were captured with guns or drugs on them that could get them locked up. Other than copious amounts of cash, the mobsters were clean. In the days before computers, it could take days or weeks to figure out who had an outstanding warrant. Perhaps more surprisingly, no one else was interested in the catch. The FBI shrugged its shoulders. The New York State Police Administration demurred. The police had nothing on the criminals, and they were all released. Most of them maintained that they were only at Barbara's house to offer him well wishes and that they had never been any plan to meet. It was just a coincidence, they insisted, that everyone came on the same day. I guess we just happened to have the same idea at the same time, one of the detained told Croswell. Ultimately, 27 people were indicted and 20 convicted of conspiracy to commit perjury and to obstruct justice by lying about the nature of the underworld meeting. But all the verdicts were overturned. While the meeting was bizarre, the judges said, common experience simply precluded the possibility that a bunch of big-time criminals would come together in so large a group to discuss crimes. Despite the lack of arrests or convictions, the meeting was a pivotal moment in the history of organized crime. Robert Kennedy, chief counsel for the United States Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management, revealed that the FBI had hardly any information on any of the criminals caught at the meeting. J. Edgar Hoover had been director of the FBI, originally the Bureau of Investigation, since 1924, but refused to acknowledge the existence of the mafia or any similar criminal network. He was more interested in the threat of communism. Criticism of his stance on organized crime grew in the 1940s and 50s, as evidence for the mafia mounted. The Apalachin meeting finally made it impossible for him to ignore the evidence. Hoover instituted the Top Hoodlum program, which ordered local bureaus to create a top 10 hoodlum list in their jurisdiction. That was easy enough for New York and Chicago, but bureaus in states like Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho turned to arresting small-time criminals and juvenile delinquents. He also ordered stricter surveillance, much of it illegal, to investigate the mob. A special report was also produced, which declared that the truth of the matter is, the available evidence makes it impossible to deny logically the existence of a criminal organization known as the Mafia. Efforts by Hoover, Congress, and men like Bobby Kennedy proved that the Mafia no longer had the protection of relative anonymity.
The meeting put the Mafia on the front page of every newspaper in America. Joe Bonanno called the meeting horrendous. All those men caught in the same place, a ton of publicity, a public relations coup for law enforcement, a field day for journalists. Bonanno's son Joe said, "The lid has been blown off of our world, and there is no way to put it back."
The man most hurt by the meeting, however, was Vito Genovese. His fellow bosses blamed him for the disaster, and Robert Kennedy embarrassed him on the national stage by revealing that his wife had left him. The suit between Vito and his wife included details about income from Genovese's various rackets, which she estimated brought in $40,000 a week.
And if all that wasn't enough, a small-time drug dealer told narcotics officers that he worked directly for Genovese, and that evidence resulted in a conviction in 1959 where he was sentenced to federal prison for 15 years, although many questioned that evidence and suggested instead that the commission had arranged to have him put away. He died in the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri in 1969 of a heart attack. He was 71.
Special thanks to the Mob Museum, the National Museum of Organized Crime and Law Enforcement in Las Vegas, Nevada. Find out more at themobmuseum.org.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguideguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes of Forgotten History, all you have to do is subscribe.